first thing I want to kind of talk about is just look at the cutting. And it's so important that as we know in many species, the source of the cutting and the quality of the cutting is paramount to getting us over the hump. And domestic produced cuttings, lower energy, not a lot of carbohydrates built into the cutting, storage issues not being perhaps stored in ideal conditions, and we would see a fair amount of loss. So we're going to touch on our new supply, and then we're going to go through this list of topics. And a lot of that are going to be really exciting. And we have some brand new research that is super relevant and important to being able to simplify your production of Dianthus. So as I alluded to before, you can see, historically producers of Dianthus would talk about anywhere between, 6 and a 15, 18% loss, and then sometimes significantly worse, just normal on Dianthus cuttings. And I think a lot of it has to do with dehydration and also the strength of the cutting. Since we've begun the cuttings in from Kenya, we've just had an excellent quality run. We have tapped into the huge Dianthus farm in Kenya, and very professional. And as you can see in the picture, it's a pretty big place. And we can now get that to the US. And not only is it a quality game, it's a numbers game. We have tapping into this global supply that gives us huge opportunities to drive the needle forward. So we're really excited. And why are we talking about Dianthus right now? Because we now have the ability to move the needle on a crop that is really underutilized in North America. There are almost 10 times as many Dianthus produced in Europe as are produced in North America. And that includes perennial types and pot types. And we want to show you why that is. And we'll go through how to do it, and then a little bit of why and how to schedule it in the end. So that being said, we'll pass it on to Mr. Doukas, who will run us through how to handle these cuttings.
Thanks, Gary. So first, you'll notice when the cuttings come in from Africa and they arrive to your location, they're going to be coming in bundles of 15. And that does have a benefit later. You can so choose to use that benefit as they're bundled in the 15 or not. But yes, so just functionally, you will have two name tags, right? You're going to have one on the inside of the bag that's going to be the European name because it's coming out of the storage cooler, right? So that's how they're going to see it, because it could be going to Europe or it could be going to us. It really depends, and that provides flexibility on their end, right? They're always going to provide us with the cuttings that have been stored for about 2 to 4 weeks. That's what they feel the optimum storage for our shipping will be. And so the outside bag will have the North American label affixed to it. So that way you don't have to go to those handy dandy decoder sheets that sometimes become so popular when we have European products shipping into North America. But as Gary mentioned here, we've seen somewhere like a normal liner shrink would be about 5 to 8%, sometimes much larger in worse conditions. But the normal so far URC shrink, we've seen less than 2%. Some growers have been much more successful to where they're getting closer to a 99%, but we don't ever want to say 100% because it is a living product and things do happen. So upon receiving, the cuttings can be stored overnight. You're looking at a target range for your cooler of 39 to 45, right? Or 4 to 7 degrees Celsius. So I mentioned that the target range, know your cooler. Make sure that in the cooler we have an analog or a secondary digital thermometer in there so we can confirm what the readings are saying on the system. And just keep in mind that we have a swing of any given cooler, right? It might go down to 45, it might go a little bit below 39, and that would be okay. But we just want to make sure that we're getting, somewhere around the lower 40s, right? We don't want to get it too warm on the swing. We don't want to get it too cold to where we have, frozen cuttings in our cooler. That would be horrible, right? And because we're trying to also rehydrate a little bit in the cooler, stay away from the fans or the what's actually actively spreading the cooling air in your cooler around. I find sometimes going visiting growers, we're right underneath that airflow, and that will have a negative effect. But you can also do that trick of the bundles is standing them up, right? Putting them in a little bit of solution or a little bit of water, similar to how you would think asparagus or celery storage would be, right? And that can actually help us begin the rehydration process because while they're not fully calloused, they are air healed. So they will pick up some nutrition and moisture, right? But we don't need to get, if we're using like a rooting hormone or something like that, we don't necessarily need to get that on the leaves. We just want to cover the base of the cutting, right? And then focus on the rehydration. for the first 48 hours, right? We want to make sure whether we're rehydrating starting in the cooler or once we go under mist, we want to make sure that we're getting a nice turgid cutting before we start backing off our night mist and really get rapid callus formation. So some prop basics on Dianthus here. So you're talking a liner time anywhere from 5 to as long as 10 weeks in North America. Now, it doesn't mean that you need 10 weeks. It just means that depending on how you're toning, holding, shearing, number of touches that you have in that liner will increase the crop time.
I think that's I think that it's a very dynamic liner that you can produce. You can literally take a very fast rooted unpinched liner and move it forward, or you can pinch the liner and bulk that liner. So you can work on getting a lot of development in the liner. It's not a hypersensitive root system like let's say like a pansy plug, where if you root a pansy plug and you get it all jammed up, the pansy never grows. These don't mind storage. They don't mind being a little overgrown. So there is a spread in that crop time, but really, like I said, you could have a unpinched rooted liner probably in 5, but depending on what you do with that liner, you might change the time, and I'm sure Nathan's going to help us figure that out here shortly.
Yes. So recommended sizes would be a 102 or denser. Really, the reason why we're recommending around a 102 and not something maybe with less cells is that you do want to create a high humidity environment around the cutting, right? We want to have a microclimate, so we're not adding moisture over top as frequently, so we can have the porous media dry out to really enhance the rooting in the callus. All right, your timing for this sort of propagation is you're looking around May or September for your perennials, right? That we want to bulk up and go into fall and then go dormant. Or more of your annuals, we can do around July through really the end of November. Now, I have had a few people get some liners from some of the rooting stations that I visited that have picked up the annualized portion of this Dianthus, your DGIs, your Lucas, your Massum plants, your Sans. They really have had a lot of later orders, but that's where we're going to be growing them more at moderate temperatures, similar to like an osteo or paracallus, right, Gary? That's what you would.
Exactly. And we have to work through the particulars of the scheduling and maximum hot humid temperature factors. But the bottom line is this is a product that is produced and sold year round in Europe. And I think we can certainly create some season extender opportunities for late spring as well as fall. But what we're going to really probably put the most energy on is where the real opportunity lies, which is the front shoulder, which is really February, March. The idea is produce it with very little energy inputs and then have it out of your greenhouse in time to still make a nice turn for Mother's Day.
From stage 1 to 2, so your callus to your roots coming out, right? We're talking about 8 to 12 days, right? And then your bottom heat's going to be preferred around 68 to 72 or 20 to 22 Celsius until visible roots. Once we get visible roots really coming down off of them, it's not necessarily important that we keep that high bottom heat on it. In fact, when I was over in Essen and we were touring some very large Oscar growers, he would admit that during the rooting out phases is when he would provide the heat, and then he would back off the higher heat during his toning of his liner, or in fact, growing out into his finished container. And again, I would recommend doing a high porous media for this liner. We don't necessarily want that heavy, wet bark type media that's really not going to help with that callus and rapid root formation. Rooting hormones can be used and recommended here. You can do 1,000 ppm liquid dips. You can do, I've seen people do an Advocate or a Hortus a KIBA spray at 100 ppm. Now, I will say with the sprays, you will get that twisting, right? The twisting of the leaves after the spray is normal for that, but you will see that relax within 3 to 5 days. NAA does harm the stems at higher rates, and that alcohol-based hormone there, can lead to induce some fusarium at that bottom of the stem, right? And that's really one of the issues that comes up in propagation and also later in finish, right? We want to make sure that bottom of the stem and that base is nice and happy and isn't drowned out, nor is it really attacked by a lot of chemical applications. It is recommended from our friends that we kind of avoid powders on this, although I know some of you will do it, and that's fine. But just be aware that we want to make sure that we're rehydrating properly after applying the powder, because we don't get a situation where the powder is actually taking the moisture from that base of the stem on that cutting after we stick it.
Yeah, if you're going to use powder, just barely dip the bottom. You don't want to get it up the stem because, like I said, it kind of, once it gets wet, it just turns into a paste and it just becomes an oxygen barrier. And you want that air around that base and the callus to get those roots out of the callus.
So as I mentioned, we do have a tendency to overmist dianthus, right? And look, it's very common between stages 1 to 2 when we have callus, and the problem gets further complicated when we have some URCs rooting out and then other ones are not. Again, if you see that situation, it's where in the future I would use and develop a rooting hormone strategy to increase the evenness on these plants. But the reason why really is if you're doing summer production, you will have to have some sort of shade. That way we can lessen the irrigation vents in the middle of the day when it's really, frightful and hot. Because if we start getting a overly saturated media, we're going to delay. We could create an environment that's really healthy for fungus gnats to chew at the base of the stem with the larvae. It's just something that we want to be very cognizant of, right? And
James, it's like a balancing act, because the reality is these are stored cuttings, and you want to be able to retain as much moisture in that stored cutting, and they've seemed to do a pretty good job with that. But the major reason why you have some that don't root and then ultimately fall out is the cuttings are desiccated. So what you tend to do is you tend to miss the beans out of it for the first 3 days or so to rehydrate any ones that are dry, and that's where the dipping might help. But then you got to recognize that now that you've hydrated those cuttings, you need to go back to a more of a dry propagation mindset and more oxygen around the base. I think that's one of the paramount things is historically with domestic supply, you need to miss the beans out of them for a few days, but then you got to realize you got to back off pretty quickly. Otherwise they get saturated. You get that we call lump callus and no roots. You get a nice big fat lump callus at the base of the cutting and no roots.
We've had great success here in West Chicago with a fog nozzle, small droplet size, and or combination with remay over the top, keeping the water off the cuttings and just holding the humidity in the air has worked great for us.
One of the things that I stumbled across, and a shout out to Jim Stepp at VWI, who kind of figured out how to do this, and it's brilliant, and that is you mount the 4-way dram fog nozzle, or Netafim fog nozzle, excuse me, onto a boom. And now instead of that fan pushing water down, it's just putting moisture in the air, and about half of it evaporates before it gets to the soil, and then it allows you to keep the humidity up without a lot of free water. It's been a huge boom in direct sticking and poinsettias, and I think it's an excellent thing to look at when you have something like a dianthus that is prone to overmisting. Sorry, James, didn't mean to.
No, not at all. Guys, please add in, because Nathan has that practical knowledge from what we're doing at West Chicago in the field offices. And honestly, Gary, you and I hardly ever get to spend any time together. You pretty much have the western part of the country, so I have the eastern part of North America. And we just don't get to go to the same growers all the time. And really, there's a lot of good information in solving very similar issues from many growers.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot of ways to skin that cat.
Yeah.
Sure. All right, so continuing on.
Yeah, so talking about lights, all right, that's been a hot button topic. Really shouldn't be, but we're illuminating a lot more of our crops, right? And when we say that we're backing up a schedule, and this is something that we can propagate in early fall, or say we're doing an annualized schedule and we're propagating in somewhere in November and December, well, and especially if we're in a northern climate, that's where I highly recommend that we have some sort of supplemental lighting, right? It doesn't have to be LEDs. It's just what provides the most moles. And I do see somebody mentioning about putting remay and prop to keep off and keep everything rehydrated. We actually eliminated that slide, but that is a good point. That is a good way of keeping that moisture around the cutting, but not necessarily getting that media saturated with mist. But going back to the lighting strategy here, it is a facultative long day plant, and long days are not required for flowering. But if we do provide long days, it will hasten the time that flowers come on. All right. So in northern climates, if you're just doing it for spring and you're in propagation, hey, you don't need to do extension. You just need to provide some supplemental moles with whatever lights that you have. But if, say, you're in a deep southern climate where you have that shoulder business hits really early, yeah, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to provide a little bit more extra moles and calories so you can get that flower flush a little bit quicker and hit that shoulder market with that milder climate where you can, get it into the landscape or get it out into containers where they can take that little bit of frost or even a freeze, as long as it's not a prolonged period of time.
I think one thing to keep in mind, if you are doing, and we'll talk about these different growing regimes, if you're doing a long perennial style production where you're propagating in the summer, you probably don't need lights in prop when you're sticking in July. But when you're trying to build that plant, when you're doing a faster crop coming around the corner, one of the keys that you have to do if you want to try to hit an early spring market is to get enough body on that plant while you still have some energy in September, October, before they kind of, you start to run out of light. And so that's where supplemental lighting in sort of the bulking phase, and then also we'll talk about it later in the finishing phase as well. So yeah, definitely can be a nice tool to help you hit your dates.
So talking about liners and PGRs, here you're talking about a Dazide or a cyclocell or lower rates combined together would be acceptable. But this is one of the crops that I do have to call out that we do have a bonsai spray, a light spray at a 1 to 2 parts utilized in the liner. And then Nathan's going to hit in much more detail here about configured to use to branching with maybe a recommended rate of 400 to 600 ppm, but this is variety specific. So again, in your operation, depending on the many varieties from selected that you're choosing, I would recommend that you do some trials before utilizing it widespread. And then we are utilizing a little bit more of the opportunity of adding some GA to stretch up the floral bud to see if we can't mechanize, because one of the things that I will tell you about and be completely honest is as we're building this over a cooler period into finish, you will get the earlier flower and the earlier flush that you can just simply roll out and pluck, but they do last a very long time. So as you get closer, you're about 4 to 5 weeks away from shipping. It's less important to debud or deflower anything, right? And then go
ahead, James.
Oh, and I was going on nutrition. So if you're going to hit on the floor,
yeah, I was just going to comment on the GA thing, and literally we work with a grower that's been playing around with it, and we saw benefits on 2 fronts. One, in the early stage when you're trying to bulk enough body to literally fill the pot with foliage to get, and so GA will expand those shoots. And not only makes more shoots, that's the configure's job, but it'll definitely elongate those shoots and get some bulk in the body out of the pot. Then we also saw an application when you have buds up, and to get those buds to flash open, you can do it like we can do with many other species, where we can pop that flower with the GA. I think it's preliminary work. It's very exciting work because it shows that we can use these tools to branch and to bulk and to hasten the flower, because that overcomes what is probably the biggest challenge in this crop, is getting the schedule just right, especially if you want to hit holidays. So these are great tools. It's super exciting where we're going to go with the research on that.
And then one of my colleagues in the South has brought up a point just to expand on when I mentioned as far as lighting is concerned. I would say that, look, supplemental lighting, and the further south you go, say you're propagating in August or September, supplemental lighting is not required. But if you're trying to hit something and you're in the deep south region, you're trying to actually get a finished crop, full and flower, sometime December or January to go into the landscape and out into the world, that's when I would not use lighting in propagation, but I would use lighting in my finish, right? And that's when I would add the additional calories. That way I can get much more of a bud set to really hit that early season, because you're just going to have less light still naturally going into that growth phase of that October through November period. So having some supplemental there can be helpful, so you don't have to back up your schedule so much. But going back to nutrition here, we have, when you see pre-roots go 75 to 100 ppm as a drench. And then, of course, like I mentioned, we have reduced light levels, right? Going into fall, if you're doing normal season production. Normal season, I would say, would be targeting months of maybe even a March, depending on how mild your climate is, or all the way into, a later May. But in that earlier March, and if we're trying to force in February and January, just be cognizant that we should bump up our nutrition, whether we're talking about, liner stage or even in the early finish stage, because we're going to irrigate less frequently. And that's where I see a little bit of jam up out in the marketplace, out at growers. is, hey, we're not irrigating as much, but we're still irrigating like 100 to maybe 125, and we're just on the border of needing a little bit more nutrition because we're not irrigating as frequently. My particular favorite would be a 17-5-17 or another calcium nitrate-based fertilizer, something with low phosphorus. But really, we just don't need that phosphorus at higher rates because we don't necessarily need that elongation stretch. So your pests and diseases, especially in prop here, your number one target, like many species, is going to be your fungus gnats, particularly your larvae stage. And then alternaria, really, depending on when you're propagating, could be an issue if you're doing late spring or you're doing through your fall. But that's generally tackled by a lot of broad spectrum fungicides. And then, as we mentioned before, there's a lot of things that there's a few things, right, in managing your moisture and also what you choose to use as hormones that can actually help you with the fusarium issue on the URCs, right? And you just don't want to provide an opportunity for injury for the disease to enter.
Typically we don't see a lot of fusarium on it in greenhouse settings, but on perennial production, outdoor production, and tunnel production, where there's a lot of other species around and the conditions are a little bit more stressful, you can run into that. And I think alternaria in the same situation. You see it flare up when they're in drippy tunnels. But again, the fusarium, you really kind of you control it culturally. The alternaria is super easy. Just a nice broad spectrum preventative spray will work wonders.
Holding and toning liners here. So again, we touched this a little bit earlier, just the opportunity to really hold and tone liners. Look, rooted liners should be toned, right, with temperature primarily. Basically, how we get that accomplished is we reduce 5 to 7 degrees or 3 to 4 degrees Celsius every 2 to 3 days until we get to about 50 to 55. And then we can actually, so while that happens, just be cognizant of, hey, they're going to transpire less. Let's not continue with the same amount of irrigations and frequency that we were doing previously, because that's how we get to an oversaturated liner, right? But the advantage is here, tone liners can be directly transplanted into protected areas in fall. Like, we don't necessarily need it in our best greenhouse space in the fall, right? Or in spring, we can go into those minimally heated greenhouses that have our ranunculus, our pansies, our osteos, something that's a low energy crop, but we're still heating to about 45, 48 at the lowest at the night, right? Now, properly toned liners, I would say we can hold for about 4 weeks. Believe it or not, the pictures there are much longer than 4 weeks on that slide. And they've had a couple more shears, but that's really speaks to the flexibility that a liner has, right? And when we're holding and toning our liners, we can plan our labor around when we're going to transplant, or, hey, I got to get these mums out, then I have time to transplant my crop, right? Or conversely, I have my poinsettias going out over the next 3 weeks. Well, we can hold these and transplant them after if we need to. We also can then create, staging of our crops through one stick week as opposed to multiple sticks like we do with many other crops in the annualized world. We do have a question here on why low phosphorus. Hey, that's just really that's what I really like to do as far as feeding is concerned. We don't need a high phosphorus on this because it's not a crop that we really want to stretch up and stretch between the internodes. There's a lot of nodes that'll come out on normal growth with this. But yeah, it's especially in propagation, I really like to stay away from having a high phosphorus feed as being my base feed that I use routinely.
Well, the other thing just to keep in mind, just general floriculture practices, you don't want a high ammoniacal nitrogen, high phosphorus feed in cold growing conditions. And we are talking about growing these things is, always cool at the very least, or downright cold. And you don't want that in those cold conditions. So you want to stick to a lower phosphorus, more nitrate based feed regime.
And we also have this first ever in North America product form of a Callus Plus that we can use into our growers. And this is something that can shave off rooting time, and it can be utilized to play a lot of fun scheduling games to really tailor your production to your own greenhouse. And this opportunity wouldn't be here without extensive trialing that we've done through Canada with some customers there, because we could originally put in Dianthus much earlier than we could from Kenya than the US marketplace. But now we're ready to launch that, and that will be a year-long program. So anytime you can get Dianthus URCs, you can get a Callus Plus product form. And Nathan, here, take it away and tell us kind of what you've seen the differences on between a URC and a Callus.
Yeah, so we had the opportunity to work with the Callus Plus pretty early on in the North American market. And so here on this slide, I've got various pictures of a few different varieties and comparing the unrooted cutting to the Callus Plus. And what you guys are going to see is an overall larger cutting. So you can see it's a lot taller, but it's also got a lot more nodes, larger leaves. These cuttings are going to be less prone to dehydration. They've already built up some of that cuticle that can develop early on in the prop stages that we're waiting on. And then you're going to notice some root initials on these guys as well in that bottom picture. So don't be surprised if there's already roots on those cuttings, and it's not going to hurt them when you stick them into the substrate either. They're going to grow roots very quickly. So as part of the trialing process, I like to, put in the methods and how we did this trial in comparing unrooted cuttings and Callus Plus for you guys. So this is more of a slide just for you to look back on, maybe pick out a few different things that you want to adjust in your own propagation. So we had top lights from Philips with a deep red, white, low blue spectrum in there. And so that's a really key component to, if your prop is a little different, maybe using high pressure sodium, or you don't have lights, take that into account when we look through some of this information. And then we use a VPD curve, so vapor pressure deficit. So our mist is automatically backing off every 24 hours to help those plants get drier and build that root system. So take those things into account when you're starting to think about your own propagation and how you're controlling your environment. So 2 weeks after stick, on the top here, we've got everything that came from Callus Plus. And then the bottom are all from an unrooted cutting. And this is in a 128 cell. And this is 2 weeks after stick, or WAS. You'll see that in a few slides here going forward. And what I really want to point out here is that, yeah, you may have a few varieties of the unrooted that root out and almost are pullable after 2 weeks. But when you compare that to the Callus Plus, you already have those fibrous root hairs going on that crop. You've got a taller plant, so it's easier to pinch earlier. And you've got branching already starting at the base of that cutting. So you're already ahead 2 weeks after stick when using a Callus Plus. So what does that look like in a full tray of cuttings? So on the left here is 2 weeks after stick. On the right is 4 weeks after stick. And then you can see the corresponding unrooted and Callus Plus trays next to each other. So obviously 2 weeks after stick, we're getting a lot more growth. This is early love here. But you'll also see a lot more budding. So because these are further along in the process, most likely a lot of these cuttings are going to be induced. So you don't be surprised that you're going to see some flowering, but it's not inhibiting the rooting whatsoever. Take another 2 weeks, jump forward, and you'll see even more growth, and you see a lot more branching. And we've almost covered up all the soil already 4 weeks after stick when we're looking at that Callus Plus. So really, when you're asking yourself, well, do I pay a little bit more for Callus Plus cuttings compared to unrooted? Where are you going to save some time and some money? So what we found through a number of trials is that really you can reduce your crop time about 1 to 2 weeks, depending on your culture and your environment, compared to unrooted cuttings. Then you also, as James said, you have the potential to eliminate close to 100% of your shrink, so the losses that you might have in propagation. So with the unrooted cuttings, we had anywhere from 1% losses all the way up to 15% for an average of 7%, which was basically what James and Gary were seeing at grower customers, right? So then with the Callus Plus form, we basically had 0 losses because they rooted so quickly. But the key there to when you make that adjustment is reducing your mist earlier. So you don't want to keep these wet. And then knowing that flowering is likely. So if you want those flowers removed, getting rid of potential diseases and whatnot, you're going to want to remove those sometime earlier on in the propagation stage.
But I know a lot of us would agree that, hey, if I can remove the flowers and touch it in a prop tray, a lot quicker than actually going out into finished containers and going through a whole crop there. Also a lot more comfortable for my employees, right? And that brings us to the opportunity for direct stick callus cuttings, right? So if your environmental control in your greenhouses, have the ability to control temperature, humidity, and light, we can go into direct stick applications. And depending on certain times of year, you might have the ability to do a direct stick application. Say, if you're doing a November sort of deal where you're sticking in November and you're in a more milder northern climate, is a lot easier to do a direct stick application than, say, if you're trying to root these alongside your poinsettias in August as a direct stick application, right? So there's going to be windows of times when you could utilize this and so choose. Really mini holiday production, right? If you're targeting a mini production for certain holidays with Dianthus, this would be an ideal situation, right? Because it's hard to transplant any sort of small liner into a mini size pot, or really ideally anywhere from your 4 to 5 inch to your core production, right? And then, you know, the opportunity may exist with more vigorous varieties and series from Selecta here for possibility of 6 inch. But that's why I don't put it on the screen yet, right? Because a lot of what I've seen people be very successful with are really that 4.5 inch to 5 inch sweet spot, right? But like Nathan said, the emphasis here really is rehydration from 24 to 48 and then pulling back quite hard, right? But when you're going to this larger cell, we don't want to stall out because we don't have the presence of feed. So just like a geranium or a poinsettia callus product, once you get the rehydration phase, putting in irrigating with a moderate strength fertilizer would be recommended, right? We want to make sure that we keep that train chugging along and we don't starve at any particular point. But this can be utilized too in backing up a schedule, right? So say, you know, my September is just absolutely horrid. You know, I either get high temperatures or I get stupid humidity, so I get no transpiration. Well, if I could back things up 2 to 4 weeks with a direct stick callus, or really about 3 weeks, because if we're taking, you know, 2 weeks off the total, taking a week off the total crop time, plus we're kind of getting 2 weeks ahead on the URC, you know, that could push us going into October where, hey, I got labor, I got a better, milder environment to handle this direct stick application.
So one of the things that is difficult to do with the Dianthus is pinching. And you look at the image on the upper right, that is sort of the evolution of the flower bud forming on a shoot. When it's a vegetative shoot, it's very difficult to get to the meristem without removing a bunch of foliage. You can see we've taken the foliage off in these pictures, but the idea is when that flower bud forms, it's much easier to pinch, but that doesn't always happen consistently. And if you try to do a hard pinch, as you can see in this picture, you end up with a pretty hacked cutting. So Nathan, tell us what we can do here.
Yeah, so this picture is what we did with hard pinch. We took a shear, and as you said, we removed a lot of the leaf material. And I think there is a little bit of delay there even if you do that. So that soft pinch worked pretty well. You can see it, the plants in the center around that orange circle, they are branching quite readily, even with just a removal of that disc budding. But you have to get down into the canopy if you want to cut that meristem in order to induce branching. So it's a pretty low pinch. So if you go to the next slide, is a perfect example there of, well, we missed it. And we keep bringing up the cell size, and we went to a larger cell size in this case for this trial, and see my grower were just cut right at the plastic level. Well, some of those plants had sunk down a little bit further, and so the meristem was a little bit lower. And as you can see, we missed the pinch on some of the liners there. So if you're doing manual and mechanical pinching, you might be introducing some variability into your crop later on. So you need to ensure that you get some pinches on it, use GA or trial it out like James was indicating, or look at configure, which I think is the next set of the slides. So we worked on a no pinch regime and comparing that to pinching on a number of different varieties you can see on the bottom of the screen there. And why we're doing this, right? Pinching is labor intensive, it's time intensive, we have potential misses, and there's also potential there to transfer disease. Anytime we're cutting and transferring sap between plants, we can transfer bacteria and viruses. So the question here was really, is there a benefit to chemical pinching? And I know a lot of people are talking about configure right now, trying it out, and they want to see, are there benefits on it? So this trial here, we sprayed configure at 3 different rates and then compared that to a soft and a hard pinch. You'll see right here on this graph, we're just comparing the control, the hard pinch, and configure at 600 parts per million. And what we did, instead of counting all those branches, because that can be quite tedious, initially we just grouped the liners on a subjective rating, whether it was high branching, medium, low, or the plant was dead. And so when we look at this graph and the number of liners that fell into those categories, we've got Deer here, and you can look back on the specific variety earlier up. That one didn't show much of a benefit, but then Early Love, we had a pretty good increase in the number of liners that had a high branching. And what we're looking here is uniformity of branching. We don't just want a few liners to have a lot of branching, we want all the liners to have a lot of branching. And so as you go to the next slide, Gary, we can see that Everlast as well, we increased the number of liners that had a high amount of branching. And then the next slide as well, with Pink Kisses, this one didn't respond as well, but it did have more liners that had that higher uniformity of highly branched characteristics. Next slide. So if you're wondering, does this apply to every variety in the assortment? Well, we haven't tested them all, but this is across, I think, 8 different varieties. And you can see that you do get branching without pinching. You get a little bit more with soft pinch or even a hard pinch. But then as you increase in the rate of configure all the way up to 600 parts, in general, you'll see an increase in the branching for every liner. Varieties did vary significantly, whether they had a positive response or no response, but we never saw a negative response. And then we'll just quickly go through these next few slides here, just showing some pictures. On the right, no pinch, no configure, and then we increase from 2, 4, and 6 as we go to the left. And you see there is a good amount of branching on the no pinch, but really at that 400 mark where it's super visible that we have a good amount of branching on these liners. And then the next slide as well, Pink Kisses, a good amount of branching, no pinch, but we do see an increase as well when we increase to that 400 to 600 parts per million.
Do you think, Nathan, that perhaps using like repeat applications, coming in, like you said, you did it, going in earlier in the prop stage and then perhaps at the end of the liner cycle or shortly after transplanting would continue to enhance the branching? Do you think that's logical?
Yeah, so this is 2 weeks. It was applied 2 weeks after stick in a 128. And repeated could definitely be beneficial. And we'll see some later application pictures in some next up slides. But yeah, it could be beneficial. I'm just not sure if you're going to get that product all to the nodes that need it, but it's worth giving a shot. And there's the I love you, and that 600 is really, in comparison to the no pinch, we're getting some great branching on that product.
That's impressive.
So Early Love, again, you can see this in that larger cell compared to a 128 and no pinch hard, and then 600 at the bottom. What we found when we counted the branches was we really didn't increase the number from the base, but this one we applied at a later stage. And so the plants look much more full. And as you'll see on the next slide here, is that later application of configure 3 weeks after stick, we hit the lateral branches with configure, which induced lateral branches on those laterals. So that's why those plants look so much more full, and that's why we're going to get an even more full plant at finish.
Gee whiz, I can think of about 10 other species we should be playing with here too, for sure.
Lateral squared.
Yeah, that's nice when you see that, because again, when we talk about one of the challenges when you're going into this fall for an early spring sale is to be able to bulk that plant early enough, and getting those branches and then letting those branches fill out will fill the pot and then also increase your flower count. But filling the pot has been one of the challenges, especially, trying to hit those early February dates.
And I think this, you really have to combine it with the feed, because that's something we didn't do. In this picture is these were a little bit hungry, and so we didn't quite get the stretch and the filling out that we wanted to. But when you compare the 600 to the no pinch, you can see just the density of shoots is way higher with 600 parts per million. So if you combine it with the right feed and the right temperature, you're really going to get a really nice bushy floriferous crop.
Very cool. Very cool. Hey, James.
Yay, back to me. So here we're talking about finishing. Yeah, I know, we're all thrilled. Water and nutrition. All right, so we've kind of touched on this. Proper moisture management is paramount in this low energy Dianthus production, right? Because we need we do really need to get the feed on, right? But at the same time, we don't need to not constantly put the water with the feed on when we don't have active transpiration, right? Especially at lower temperatures when we're out in our minimally heated or probably no heated greenhouses, right? Depending on what style we're growing, it can lead to an opportunity for an opportunistic pathogen, right? Like Fusarium to get away into our plants. I rarely see Pythium on Dianthus, but I'm sure there are Pythiums that would take, you know, an opportunity for entry into these plants. But when I say we really want to do is keep even moisture, right? So we want to irrigate, and this is Dr. Will Healy's media moisture scale, really for plugs that we're adapting to finish. Dr. Healy, unfortunately, is no longer with us here at Ball, enjoying a nice, fruitful retirement. But I'm going to continue to use his terminology because it is so good here to really describe the level of moisture. We want to, irrigate evenly to a 3.5, maybe up all the way to a 4, but we never want to go to a saturated 5, right? Especially in a cool greenhouse or no heated environment. And then we do want to irrigate, let it dry down to about a 2 or a 2.5, right?
So just from experience growing in the Pacific Northwest, where growing in January, it's kind of like we refer to it as growing in the closet. We have almost no light. And one of the things you have to be careful not to do, and I think James made an excellent point about the low nutrition, when you're less irrigating, you got to feed more. The other thing is you can sit on the cusp of a 2 going to a 1 for 2 weeks, and the plant's not going to wilt, but it ain't going to grow. So you don't want to go, it's very easy to say, hey, look, I'm just going to let it go a little bit further drier in these really cold conditions, but you will stall the plant. So you want to stay 2 to 4, and you don't want to never go to a 1, even though the plant won't wilt, but it's just not going to move. So just keep in mind, in those lower conditions, you want enough moisture, and then also keep the nutrition up.
And look, we have a lot of plants that are very responsive to temperature and are more like the hare going to the finish line of the race. But Dianthus, think of it very much like it's the tortoise. Slow and steady is going to win this race and get you to the finish line with a very durable product for your marketplace. So we're gonna feed moderately during our bulking and our growth stage, right, and up into our forcing or finishing stage, depending on how we're growing and scheduling. And that's what I'm talking about, where we're not providing a high amount of phosphorus. We're definitely not doing something like a 12, 52, 30. That's what we're staying away from completely. Right? At most, we're doing a 20, 10, 20.
No. You don't want to.
It doesn't need. You don't need it. You don't need it.
You don't need it. It's just a waste, and it's risky.
Yes.
Stick with the CalMag feeds. Stick with the CalMag feeds.
We don't need soft growth, right? The temperatures are what is going to check things. We need hard, good, consistent growth. Yep. All right. And of course, as your temperature is lowered, increase your feed. Finishing media, much more forgiving, right? But just keep in mind that you have a coarser mix, and those with bark, you're going to have to feed higher rates of nitrogen because of the fixation. And basically for the media, we're just trying to keep a 5.8 to a 6.3. Going also into finish in our modest temperature greenhouse here. So we're really going to make sure that we can hit the market dates with the later flowering varieties here. We're going to try to, reduce crop time. The nights here are going to be around your 58 to your 60 or your 15 degrees Celsius. And, you're opportunistically going to catch that warm summer heat, or warm solar heat, right? So when we do have a sunny day, the greenhouse can warm up naturally with the sun. And here's where, if you were in a forcing opportunity, right? So you're trying to hit that February holiday, or you're trying to hit that very early March. This is where you're using that supplemental lighting to add more calories to get a better flush, or actually hit your Valentine's Day marketplace. And this is where, because you are forcing temperatures, now this isn't, a really dramatic night temperature, but this is more on the higher end of a Dianthus. You might need to add a little bit of PGR to counteract that, right? Because we don't want that soft, stretchy growth.
What you don't want to do is grow too warm, because they'll just stay vegetated. So you need to keep that night below 60. That's paramount.
And then here in like a cool greenhouse, right, when we're growing with our pansies and ranunculus, we're targeting night temperatures of 48 to 55, right? And if we have a flush on these, we can definitely lower our temperatures down, right? And I have some some pictures of some greenhouses where they're literally holding a very finished crop. But here, this is one where, we did most of the bulking in our fall stage, and we just kept them in a moderately warm greenhouse, and we ended up hitting a very suitable product because we did all our growth on the front end in fall. And now when we're coming into that February period, we'll just have our night temperatures up just significantly to where we're above, that threshold where we might have dormancy, so we can have a nice flush product. And then finally, your cold greenhouse, which would be your typical perennial style. And this could also be outdoors, or you're going into a non-heated cold frame entirely. And this is where you're really playing with that durable product that can be tolerant to freezes here. Okay?
The majority of the production in Europe is of this style, be it in the Netherlands in a drained irrigation system greenhouse with no heat and with a heating set point of like -2 or -3. Or as you can see, the picture on the left here is just a rainproof, open-sided structure in Latina Italy, where Mother Nature's doing the business. And then on the right, that's in Spain, grown right outside in the field. So these things are very tough. They can take a freeze, but as you go to these very cold temperatures, it's gonna be a slower crop cycle. So for example, these Oscars here on the left in this unheated greenhouse, these were planted in week 34, 35, and now just coming to market the 1st of March. So again, that is taking it to that super cold, have been frozen a couple of times level.
All right. And then as far as your finishing guide is concerned here with your insects to be aware of, hey, it's really your fungus gnats might be, if you have a super high population, the larvae could be chewing on the roots, very similar to like where you have it in propagation. But typically we don't see populations at that high, especially as we're reducing the temperature. The fungus gnat larvae, the adults won't be moving around. And we do see a little bit of thrip action coming onto the flowers. But again, normally speaking, unless you're doing 365 production where you're trying to get a flowering indoor crop, we typically don't, in the middle of summer, mind you, typically don't see thrips as being a major issue because it's a cool season and many of the outdoor thrips haven't become active in your particular location. So it's one of those things where we're on the shoulder season, so we just typically miss major insect problems typical of our industry based on when we're growing this and what market we're trying to hit. Mites could be a minor issue and they might flare up on there if you're into, but typically I see that, and Gary sees that as well, when we have an active population, right? We have an active population on mites already. So it's not something I would preventatively spray for unless I knew that I had an issue somewhere on the property and I am in those warm summer months. And then here in your finishing, again, your Alternaria is going to be your #1 disease that you're targeting. I'm repeating myself slightly on the Fusarium being an issue as far as injury is concerned. And then I just want to call out that botrytis is less of an issue than what we would see at low temperatures from other crops. All right. And this picture is actually from last January, where this grower had gotten a little backed up over there in Germany with his crops. And he has a 10 centimeter Oscars and he's holding them just above freezing, right? He's at 3 degrees centigrade, he's just cruising right along and he's got full color and there's not a sign of botrytis or fallout in the whole crop. And that was quite impressive. I can't fit all those plants into one picture, but a very colorful panorama.
All right, so the next thing we're going to do, finish up with, is talking about scheduling and how do you pick what to grow and how to schedule it. And that's the dynamic part of Dianthus. Probably the most dynamic part is because their energy machine and within a given range, you can use supplemental lighting, you can use temperature to develop these. And then there's also a spread of genetics. So we're just going to kind of go through some of the different variables that you have when you're trying to figure out how to schedule it. So we have some branded products that Selecta has branded. And the reason we branded these 2 genetics is because they're so naturally early to flower. They're very easy for many growers in all regions to hit Valentine's Day. So we decided to focus on the easy button. And so this is what this is all about. This is a early genetic, ideally suited for Valentine's Day. I Love You, very compact, and very free flowering. And then early love, again, a little bit more vigorous, but again, that very early timing. If you want to not do a branded program, our Oscar family, which is really nice because it's sport-based, and you see several of the pictures you saw of these co-production in Europe, James had and I had, these are different growers growing Oscars. This is the one that you see the most as a series grown. And it's very useful in the fact that the uniformity makes it all the colors balance evenly. It's very compact and very early. So it's really ideally suited for those early opportunities.
Just to mention on the Oscars, Gary, before we go on, I mean, if you want to make colorful combinations for an earlier season, you know, using Dianthus, the Oscars are your series, right? Since they're sport-based. It's something that we can do with a sports-based series where you can put multiple colors together in the same pot and they will balance out, right?
And that being said, so are the Diodors. So these are another sport-based series. And the idea is Diodor, the magenta white, the original, we wanted to mutate this and bring other bicolors, and they're all fragrant as well. So they're nice, they're early to flower, bicolor and fragrant, a little bit more robust and vigorous than an Oscar. But again, these nice sport-based families are super easy to grow as a grouping. One of the newest product for us is Capitan, which is just, again, it brings the scale up to a larger 8-inch and beyond pot. So we're really excited about this one. It brings some cuttable stems. So it's just a whole new genre, very much a North American style product versus the small pot, 10, 12 centimeter pot that dominates Europe. We think this one can get some traction. And then this one has a lot of opportunity. This is called Vivacia. And really what you can see here in this trial, this is pretty much the series of core colors that is designed ideally in North American speak for a 2.5 quart to 1 gallon product, one plant per, all double flowered, all very traditional looking carnation. So again, a lot of options for different seasonality and also different uses. So you really kind of need to know what you're trying to produce, the pot size, and when. Additional to these pot types, we have a couple of different series of perennials. The Everlast is not a series, it's a collection. There's all different types in there. There's singles and doubles. And again, these are all relatively early flowering, but these are zone 5 hardy perennials, so they will definitely work perfectly in a perennial program, even though they're pretty enough that you could put them into a pot if you wanted to. Pink Kisses, which is the top seller globally, is actually a very nice zone 5 perennial, but it's being sold as a pot carnation because it is so beautiful. So again, genetics will speak to hardiness, but use is open to any of these. You can figure out how to move all of them. New series for us is Pashmina. It's very fun. It's a low growing, almost ground cover type family, 3 varieties. It's very nice. We've had just great results with that so far. So we're very excited about that as a perennial as well. So when you want to talk about scheduling, you've got to look at, you know, we talked about the genetics and what you want to do with it and when you want to sell it. But you have to look at these other factors, regional variabilities. I mean, crop times in Homestead are going to be dramatically different than the crop time in, let's say, Edmonton. They're all very doable, but we have to take into account that there's a lot of regional variabilities. The type of structure, are you on a bench? Do you have bottom heat? Do you have lights? Do you have glass? Do you have poly? These are energy machines. The more light you give them, the more molds you give them, the better they'll develop. So they love bright and cool. Honestly, we had our very first, it's exciting because of the quarantines, we have our very first breeder trial of Dianthus, and we're growing it. The first breed we had is in our Rio Grande, California location. And in that situation, they've had incredibly cold and funky weather this winter, but these plants have been very, very cold. And but they do get periods of high light, and you can see the strength of these plants, the strength of the tissue is really predicated on the light. We see that in Homestead as well. So there's a lot of variabilities in your region. There's a lot of variabilities in the type of structure. And then, of course, the seasonality. When do you want to grow these things? This can be very different. You can fast crop these in sort of the modest greenhouse regime for a May, June sale. Whereas if you want to get it out the door in February, you're going to have to run a longer cold regime. And then, of course, you want to try to hit a holiday, you've got the variability of the weather. And so we have a few things we can do to help mitigate that. One of them is supplemental lighting. And you can, if you are trying to hit not naturally early genetic for Valentine's, like Pink Kisses, which is naturally more of a April, May product, can be done for Valentine's Day. We have a lot of growers doing it, but they are adding supplemental light. They're growing at these modest temperatures, and oftentimes using a little growth regulator. And what's very interesting is when you look at the different types of light, in typical LED growing scenarios, you're not needing to add the growth regulator because the internets are staying shorter. But under the HPS lights, the sodium lights, infrared from the sodium definitely causes some elongation. And so you start to look at using PGR applications, light spray applications in the end. They're really not about controlling the size of the plant. It's about leveling off the height of that flower as it comes up and as you force it through with lights and temperature. So again, you can use lights, you can use warm temperatures. Forcing the color, this is an example of some Pincusses that were rolling a little bit behind. They were beautiful plants and they were all budded up. They just wouldn't turn the corner and the flowers wouldn't open. So cranked up the temperatures, a little touch of PGR, and boom, you've got a lot of color. So again, you can force these guys to hit dates, but just recognize if you're forcing with lights, with temperature, with increased feed, then you get into the possibility of needing a PGR application. But they are forcible. What you don't want to do is grow them contiguously warm, because then they'll just stay vegetative. But you can grow them cool and then force them, up to 68, 70 degrees once the buds are on the plant to pop the color. So you can use these techniques to hit your schedules. So we have on our website, we have these charts. And the charts pretty much talked about what the variety is, the details about it, recommended pot sizes. And they have this little scheduling chart too. And we talked about earlier the different types of growing regimes. This brings into the earlier, very early, mid, and late varieties and when you would plant them to achieve the goal. It looks a little bit confusing, but when you take a minute to study it, it's pretty clear. If you don't want to go down that route, you can simply go into a variety selection tool and you pick the parameters that you want, and it will make recommendations for varieties. So we can continue to develop these tools and bring more of these tools to bear. One of the things that we're going to be doing is going out with a survey of customers to look at when people finished in different regions with the different products, so that if we can get real-time data on scheduling, that's going to help us answer the question. Because in a nutshell, we are very confident. I'm going to not speak for Nathan, but as a grower, not a researcher, Nathan's going to have a higher bar for yay or nays than I do. But as a grower, I'm very confident that we can develop and we will develop no pinch regimes. I have seen direct stick and calloused in a grower in 4-inch and literally booms on it for 4 days and then never touched again until they're shipped. So I know that we have the techniques to grow these things are very resistant and durable and don't prone to a lot of disease and insects. The challenge we have to learn is how to schedule the different types for different dates. And that's just, and we have tons and tons of product out there right now, tons of trials going, and we just consolidate that data and share that with you. So that will be coming on the website, will be a more crunchy literally by latitude type scheduling tool.
But yeah, I know you and me and Gary definitely keep Nathan engaged and interested in this, making sure that we don't go too far from the rails and he pulls us back in.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what, he's done a couple of things that made me scratch my chin too. So he's pretty creative. So some of the stuff he's screwing around with is pretty fun. So I think Nathan will, he'll answer questions we haven't asked yet, James, which is always a really good thing.
Always a good time.
Absolutely. So I wanted to just finally here, as we come to an end, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Also want to take this time to call out our tech team. Ball has a tech team. It's been in development for several years now, and it's just a wonderful thing to be a part of this. We have people, literally experts from all over the world, supporting our efforts. We have a genetics lab in Ball Helix. We can map out and identify strains of pathogens. We have full-time pathologists working at our assistance. And so the Ball Tech team is a wonderful resource. I encourage you to utilize it. We're here for Ball customers, frankly, anybody. And you can see the different ways to connect to the tech team. And then also, if you want to reach out to either the three of us directly, there's our email addresses. But again, thank you all for joining us on this journey on Dianthus.